Margaret Cain speaking, and it's April of 1987. On this tape, I am going to give some things I remember about Unity Village in the 1940s. It was called Unity Farm in those days because they had many farm workers and they sold fruit, honey, and jelly on a roadside stand across from the entrance. They had vineyards, a greenhouse, a cider mill, a machine shop, a dairy, as well as peach and apple orchards. I went to Unity Village about 1945 to study for a month in what was called the Unity Training School. At that time, there was no cafeteria, no administration building, no activity center, no cottages, no motel rooms. There was just the tower, the silent Unity building, the apartments, and houses belonging to the Fillmores and others who lived on the grounds. In addition, there was the hotel, the annex, the swimming pool, and the outdoor amphitheater where band concerts were held in the summertime. Now, the main office of the whole organization was located in the silent Unity building, where church services and classes were also held. On a Sunday morning, there was a Sunday school class meeting in what is now called the small Peace Chapel. But in the silent Unity Chapel, I heard Mr. Fillmore speak. In fact, all classes and meetings were held there. The first floor of the silent Unity building to the right was where we students slept. There were uncomfortable cots in small cardboard cubicles, you might say, and these partitions did not go to the ceiling. There were people talking and snoring at night. Needless to say, there was little privacy, but we made the best of it. To take a bath, we had to climb the stairs to the second floor on what might be called the public stairway. On the second floor, there was a shower room across the hall from the telephone room where workers were receiving prayer requests. I believe the prayer room on that floor has been the same for many, many years. No outsiders were allowed. I did not see inside that room until I had been ordained as a minister for several years. However, later on I was asked to conduct a prayer service for the silent Unity workers. That was a couple of years before I retired, I think. But the large room to the right on the second floor of the silent Unity building had desks for all workers and helpers. Toward the rear was Charles Fillmore's office, later occupied by May Rowland, and now by Charles Fillmore, the grandson, I believe. In the basement of that one and only silent Unity building, there was a washing machine and an ironing board, which I use sometimes on Saturday mornings. It was as dark as a dungeon in that basement. And this basement had a tunnel going to the tower. Later on, all buildings were connected with tunnels so people could walk back and forth without going outside in rainy weather. Somewhere along the line, I remember a worker at Unity trying to sweep and clean around me on a Saturday morning as I was typing. We had a small typing room in the basement. Finally, he leaned on his broom and he said, and I quote, "You are like God, everywhere evenly present." I was in his way. I still have a picture of him. His name was Dallas Craig. K-R-E-I-G-H was the last name. When I first went to Unity Farm, we ate our meals on the first floor of the apartment building. Sometimes, if the weather was pleasant, we could eat on the porch. It was not a cafeteria. Meals were served family style. It was in this place on a Sunday noon I sat across from Papa Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity. He was a small man with a slight limp. The skin on his face was very pink, and he had a twinkle in his blue eyes. He loved to laugh and to tell stories. He had a great sense of humor. I do remember that he ate heartily. He was dressed in a dark suit with a little Lord Fauntleroy collar and a large bow tie. If we had any conversation, I don't remember it. I probably was in a state of shock. I had a class in the Mysteries of Genesis conducted by Charles Fillmore about 1946. His second wife, Cora, was with him on the platform. She would pull his coattails if he talked too long. It was Cora who graded our papers. In this class, we had to give a 2-minute speech at the end of the course. I walked all around the grounds rehearsing my little speech. The class members were so nervous when they stood up to speak before the gentleman that they were shaking. I don't remember being that way exactly. The next day, Mr. Fillmore asked Dr. Dale who I was. He wanted me to come to work in Silent Unity. Dr. Dale was a former osteopathic physician and the registrar of the training school at that time. He had visited in our home here in Springfield. He told Mr. Fillmore that I had a husband and 2 children at home, and he doubted that I could come to Unity Village. Anyway, I was glad Mr. Fillmore noticed me. It was not the divine plan for me, I am sure. Well, I was in the audience several times when Mr. Fillmore gave the sermon. He used many affirmations and would often stop in the midst and say, "Let's take these words into the silence." And we did. He passed away July the 5th, 1948. He had had a kidney infection. He is known to have said these words, and I quote, "I wanted to stay in this body longer, but the Lord of my being rules otherwise," unquote. He was in a coma, and toward the end he awakened, opened his eyes, and smiled, and left this earth. Mr. Fillmore was active until the end. Several years later, they found this affirmation in his desk. It goes like this: "I fairly sizzle with zeal and enthusiasm, and spring forth with a mighty faith to do the things that ought to be done by me." And he wrote this in his 94th year. Just think of it. Well, I would like to go back a little bit to Myrtle Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, the mother, the love nature of the whole movement. She is the one who accepted the idea of healing from a truth teacher in Chicago. This man's name was Mr. Weeks, I believe, and he told her this particular statement. He said, "You are a child of God and do not inherit disease." She had been very ill and doomed to die with tuberculosis. By practicing these new ideas, Mrs. Fillmore was eventually healed and began to help others. Mr. Fillmore came into this new philosophy a little later, after he saw what had happened to his wife. He was a man of action. He gave up his real estate work. He dared to publish a magazine when he knew nothing about the work. of publishing. He went ahead with the business end of this new unity movement. And of course, he even started a radio program in 1924. It was called the Unity Viewpoint. I remember hearing about this at the village. Later, it was broadcast on a Bloomington, Illinois station. Mrs. Fillmore founded the Silent Unity Prayer Department, I think we could say. She was the one who started the publication of Wee Wisdom magazine for children. It is the oldest magazine in continuous publication in the United States. Also, the Unity Training School was established in 1931 before Mrs. Fillmore's death. Now, I did not know the first Mrs. Fillmore. She was before my time. But according to the books, she willed her passing on October the 6th, 1931. She told her friends she was going to leave this earth to make a change. She thought it would be easier to do her work from the invisible plane. And on the Wednesday before her passing, she helped her husband of 50 years lead the midweek service. The next day, she was at her desk, putting things in order. That evening, she left the office in Kansas City and went to the house called the Arches at Unity Farm. And by the way, the Arches had no kitchen, and I was a visitor several times in the building called the Arches. Well, on this day, she picked apples on a stepladder. She visited with friends. The next morning, Myrtle Fillmore was ill, and in a day or two, passed away. 2 years later, Mr. Fillmore married Cora Diedrich, who had served the Fillmores as a private secretary for many years. She really watched over him and took good care of him from 1933 to 1948. And of course, as I said before, she was the Mrs. Fillmore on the platform when I had the class. They lived in a small house across from Unity Village. 'Tis said Mr. Fillmore sometime prayed all night, and I think he was using affirmations. Mrs. Cora Fillmore passed away soon after her husband left, but the work went on. I consider it a very great privilege for me to have known Mr. Fillmore and to have attended his classes. Not too many ministers can make this statement today. It seems to me that the cottages must have been built soon after my first trip to study at Unity School in 1945. The second summer, I did not sleep on the cots in the cubicles, as I remember. By this time, the Silent Unity workers were on the first floor, and we used the second floor of the building for exercises and singing classes. Dr. Leroy Dale was in charge. He was a large man with a booming voice. He would have us sing and exercise at the same time. He had laughing sessions. Oh, how he would laugh, and we would laugh, as you can imagine. Most of the songs were familiar tunes, but with new and different Unity words. This class was held at 11 a.m., so Dr. Dale would tell us to sing a certain song as we marched to our lunch at the apartments. And I remember this one time, he had us singing this: I'm one with God, He's one with me. I'm one with God, He's one with me. Over and over again we had to sing. This was to the tune of the Sweet Genevieve. There were many songs I still remember. Dr. Dale published a book of his songs and affirmations, and it's out of print, but I have a copy. And speaking of Dr. Dale and his songs, makes me think of Charles Roth, the minister in Indianapolis for many years. He did not come to the village until the 1950s, I believe, but he told me one time of how he felt singing these particular words for Dr. Dale. I quote, "I love everybody in God's universe, and everybody loves me," over and over. And Charles would argue and argue with himself that he didn't love everybody and everybody didn't love him. But I guess he sang the words anyway, and he must have conquered. Charles Roth was a mail carrier in Rochester, New York, if I remember correctly. He had a wife and children when he came to Unity Village to study. He has done a great work for Unity. I visited his church several times. Charles was ordained in 1955. He visited here and spoke 2 times in our old location on South 7th Street. Once he told about his trip to the Holy Land and had tears coming down his cheeks. One time he and his wife had dinner at my home along with other ministers from Illinois and Indiana. Maybe you would like to know about some of my teachers when I was studying at the village. One of my teachers at the village was Mrs. Louise Beatty from St. Petersburg, Florida. And she taught me lessons in truth. And of course I had to write lessons on that same book for the correspondence course also. Mrs. Beatty had a tremendous influence upon me because she had overcome a physical handicap herself. She passed away in St. Petersburg, where I go in the winter, rather recently at an advanced age. I think I could safely say that Mrs. Beatty was the founding minister of the Unity Church I attend in Florida now. I remember, and I say this with all humility, that she wrote on one of my papers that I had a beautiful consciousness and she would be following my ongoing. I really didn't know what she meant, but I'm glad she noticed me. In the 1940s, I was in the first class taught by James Dillett Freeman. He had been working at the village for quite a while. He was a poet, remember. But the textbook he taught was Effectual Prayer. And I found it very, very helpful. And he is the one who wrote on my paper, for some reason or another, I suspect I had given an example, and he wrote that I should not be so hard on myself. And I'm still hard on myself, I think. But I watched Mr. Freeman a while later as he had to work through the death of his first wife when he was very young. Maud Kellogg was one of my teachers at the village, and she said she would go to Unity Village if she had to crawl all the way. And of course she was our minister in Springfield for a while, and I knew how great she was, and she was instrumental in getting me to Unity Village in the first place and starting the correspondence course. And I worked for her as her secretary here in Springfield. I really can't remember the names of all my teachers, but I do remember a Harriet Fouts. The last name is spelled capital P-F-O-U-T-S. She was from Kansas or Nebraska, I think. She was quite strict and didn't give good grades. However, I still say one of her affirmations almost every day. William Quinn from Ohio was my teacher. Also Francis Gable. Oh, I really liked that man. Francis Gable started the Good Business magazine, which is no longer in print. He and his wife lived on the grounds. Georgiana Tree West was my instructor. She wrote a book on prosperity, and she told the class members who expected to be ministers never to stand up in front of people with a spot on your clothes. Isn't it strange, some of the details that I can remember? Maybe you'd like to hear about Eric Butterworth. I first saw Eric Butterworth at Unity Village. He was about 20 years of age. He was singing a solo in the church meeting. He had a very fine voice. He has been serving in New York City for 20 or 25 years. Before that, he was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Detroit, Michigan for several years. He has made a great contribution to the Unity movement. He was ordained in 1949, just a year before I was ordained. His sister Margaret was ordained with me. She lives and works as a minister in California. Well, as I mentioned, I was ordained in 1950. The ceremony was held in the new Unity Temple in Kansas City, the first and only time, I think. I was ordained by Lowell Fillmore, who took his father's place. Some of my ordained friends have passed away or did not continue in the ministry. Quite a few did not. But Andrew Carlson was ordained with me, and he wrote the very fine article in the April 1987 issue of the Unity Monthly magazine. He is alive and well. I had a letter from him not too long ago. Warren Meyer and Margaret Butterworth are the only two members of my class still in active ministry, I think. By this time, the Unity cafeteria was in operation in a new building. No meat was served in those days. Fish was served at banquets. Other dishes made out of substitutes resembled meat. They served wonderful desserts and salads and vegetables. People came from everywhere to eat at the Unity Village. I remember the first time meat was served on the grounds. There was a big dinner in the picnic area one summer evening, and caterers were hired and brought in cooked beef, and I thought the whole Unity movement was ruined. Mrs. Meek, my first teacher, told me that Unity people don't eat meat. It isn't so, really. But all that changed. Real meat and artificial dishes are served at the village now, I think. Well, I made friends at Unity Farm. Sometimes we would take a bus to Kansas City on Saturday to shop or to see the sights. There were buses stopping several times a day at Unity. We would sometimes ride around if anybody had a car. It was so exciting to see the tower in the distance as we approached the village. And in riding around one time, someone in the car taught us a new song entitled, "I'm Getting Ready for a Miracle." I'm getting ready for a miracle. You know it, I'm sure. Then I'd like to speak, if I may, a little bit about the building program throughout the years. The administration building was finished about 1959, and church and Sunday school services were held on the second floor. The library and many offices were located in this new facility. Soon afterward, the Bridge of Faith was dedicated at the time of the ministers' conference, and all of us placed our blessings in the cornerstone. Things changed again after the Activity Center was completed in 1975. The church services and meetings were moved to this newest location. There will be another change when the new Silent Unity building is finished in a year or two. Then those men and women in training to be ministers will occupy the present Silent Unity building for their activities and study. In the early 1950s, I was invited to teach lessons in truth in the training school. The most famous person in my class was Catherine Ponder, a young Southern gal. It was her first trip to Unity School, and at that time she was working in an office, had a small child, and was divorced. She came from some southern state, I don't remember exactly which one. But most of you know how far she has come in writing successful books on the subject of prosperity. She introduced me to her husband as her Lessons in Truth teacher. This was several years ago. It must have been about 1976 that I took a group from Springfield to Unity Village on a chartered bus. We had the opportunity to hear Dr. Marcus Bach speak in the new activity center. Most of the people on the trip had never been to the village before, and there were several man and wife couples. I know it meant a lot to all of them, and we had a wonderful time. I made many trips to Unity Village after I was ordained, and then when I was elected to the Board of Trustees of the Association of Unity Churches, I often went in January for special meetings. I never fail to feel thrilled when I walk on the grounds of Unity Village. Now I'm going to give a few details which come to my mind. One of the greatest things that happened in the 1940s and has continued even until now is the voice of Charles Fillmore comes over the loudspeaker at 11 a.m. each day. The workers all pause as Mr. Fillmore prays the Lord's Prayer. The workers stand. I was so thrilled in those days to walk through the printing department and also the mailing section. There were huge carts, perhaps 4 feet long, 3 or 4 feet wide, just piled high with stacks of Daily Word magazines. The stacks were almost as tall as I. It was the same with the Wee Wisdom and other magazines. To see all these books ready to be mailed gave me a greater realization of the magnitude of the movement. I think the printing is farmed out, perhaps. It's done elsewhere these days. Another thing that has stayed with me is this. In the Silent Unity building where we had our classes, there was an affirmation printed and hanging on the wall, and it said, "Jesus Christ is the head of this class. I am open and receptive to his instruction and guidance." And I used that statement at the beginning of many of my classes in Springfield. I sometimes would ask myself when teaching, if Charles Fillmore came to my class right now, would he approve of what I'm saying? It made me think. I'd like to enlarge just a little bit, I hope this tape doesn't run out, on the band concerts held in the amphitheater in the 1940s. There was a huge stage upon which the band sat and played, and the leader was Mr. Frankheiser, who had directed a circus band before coming to Unity. And these concerts were always on a Sunday night. The grass was green and well-tended. There were many benches and settees, and lots of people came from all around the area. There would be a quartet to sing. There would be a sermon, usually by some visiting minister. And I heard Dr. Norman Vincent Peale speak at one of these outdoor meetings. He was and is friendly to Unity. And back to Mr. Frankheiser, whom I mentioned a moment ago, he wrote quite a few of the songs in the Unity hymnal we use today. There was a time ordination services were held in the amphitheater, but so often in Missouri, in the summertime, the rains would come. In that case, at the last minute, the service would have to be moved indoors. I have seen people dancing on the large stage when it wasn't a religious service. It seems to me a dance was held perhaps every Saturday night. But through the years, the amphitheater has deteriorated and events are not held there anymore. Different workers at Unity Village had homes around the area. May Rowland had a home on the ridge. I visited her. Richard Lynch had a home there also. Quite a few lived in Lee's Summit, and some commuted from Kansas City, 20 miles away. I always treasured the Unity Library. They had a wonderful historical library. From time to time, I have given to them some special old books which have come into my hands. I still have copies of some early books which are bound in leather. Pictures of all ordinands are posted for each year in the library, unless it has been changed since I retired. However, I am not proud of my photograph there. But if I had to pick one blessing from my trips to Unity Village, it would be the affirmations I learned from Mr. Fillmore, from Dr. Dale, Maud Kellogg, and others. Also it would be the truth words we learned in the exercise and the singing class to well-known old tunes. I think I really became a new creature. I wouldn't take anything for these years. I learned the power of thoughts and words. And I'll have you know that I didn't learn to smile until I became a Unity minister. With this little bit of chit-chat, I think I will conclude this little essay. God bless you all, and with love, Margaret Cain.